I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, the immediate aftermath of Monday's Israeli elections, the third attempt in the past 11 months to produce results that can create a coalition government to lead the State of Israel. And while the initial results look like Benjamin Netanyahu would be certain to be able to put together a governing coalition of 61 or more Knesset seats, the slimmest majority needed to lead the 120-seat Israeli parliament, the latest results now show that the Likud-led right-leaning bloc has only 59 seats, Likud winning 36, down from the initial 37 seats. The two Orthodox parties, Shas and United Torah Judaism, with 10 and 7 seats respectively, and Naftali Bennett's Yamina party with 6 seats. And that totals 59, 2 seats short of the required magic number of 61. As you see on the left, Benny Gantz's Blue and White Party is now at 32 seats, down 1 from the early tally, and the coalition of Labor, Gesher, and Meretz parties won 7 seats, and that totals only 39 seats. And even if Avigdor Lieberman's Yisrael Beitenu party joined the Blue and White coalition with their 7 seats, that would only raise the total to 36. Now, the Arab coalition of parties currently has the remaining 15 seats, and were Avigdor Lieberman and the Arab coalition to both join Blue and White, they would have a majority of 61 seats. But most analysts believe it is a virtual impossibility that Avigdor Lieberman would join a coalition with the joint Arab list, and it's highly doubtful that Blue and White would join with the Arab list. So the left-leaning parties, by the way, I want to see the list again. I don't know if it's very unlikely that Yisrael Beitenu would join, right, with the Arabs, and it's very unlikely that Blue and White would join with the Arabs. So the left-leaning parties seem to have no way to form a coalition government, and all eyes are now turned towards Bibi Netanyahu, who finds himself with the opportunity to convince at least 2 members on the left, or to convince Avigdor Lieberman to join his coalition. By the way, there are still ballots to be counted. Those cast by members of the IDF, those cast by Israeli diplomats abroad, and by Israeli prisoners who have the right to vote. In addition, while the coronavirus did not seem to dampen voter turnout, and this election saw an increase in the number of Israelis voting, as you can see on your screen, some 5,000 Israelis who may have been exposed to the coronavirus wound up in quarantine and voted in quarantine, and their votes also will need to be counted. But if the seats total remain the same, it's up to Benjamin Netanyahu to see if he can find the additional 2 seats needed to once again become the Prime Minister of Israel. Well, how are these election results been received by the Israeli people? And what likelihood is there that Mr. Netanyahu will be able to find at least 2 more seats? For insight and analysis in the State of Israel, we turn, as we so often do, to the outstanding political analyst for the Times of Israel, Haviv Rettig Gur. Haviv, thank you for joining us once again here on JBS.
Thank you for having me, Mark.
Haviv, as we just described it, are the numbers pretty accurate as far as you can tell?
Yeah, those are numbers that we're all familiar with. We have come to understand that these are probably the final numbers. There aren't really enough what we call double envelope votes, which are, as you said, prisons and army and people in all sorts of situations where they can't get to their ballot box, to their ballot stations. We don't think we have enough to dramatically affect the final result. And so Netanyahu has 59 seats. It doesn't look like he has the ability at this point with the uncounted votes to reach 60. I want to remind you, Mark, that this whole year-long saga began after the April election, when that right-wing Haredi coalition of Likud, Shas, United Torah Judaism, and the parties that became Yamina, and something called Kulanu that has merged with Likud, that coalition that we're talking about as Netanyahu's coalition had 60.
Yes.
So 11 months later, it has a seat less. And we might be just as stuck as we were back in April.
Fascinating. By the way, in Israel, do Israelis consider Netanyahu to have won this election?
There are several ways of measuring whether you win an Israeli election. Nobody wins an Israeli election on election day. The fact that Netanyahu delivered a victory speech was propaganda. It was part of the campaign. You win an election by negotiating your coalition and becoming prime minister in the roughly 6 weeks after election day. So in a very sort of narrow technical sense, there's no sense in which Netanyahu won. He does not have a majority. He has managed to go through 11 months and rancorous campaign and a lot of money spent and a lot of anguish and 3 elections and get to exactly what it was 11 months ago. But there's no question that in September he saw a drop of seats, saw a drop of voters, and now yesterday those voters came back and those seats came back. First time in 2 elections, he has more seats than blue and white. He doesn't have the seats to become prime minister at this moment, barring some of the we're talking about people changing sides, etc. But did do better than the last. So there's a sense that he rallied. There's a sense that it's a very successful campaign, but he hasn't won.
Okay. What is clear, though, he did not lose, correct?
Yes, he did not lose. Nobody lost, which unfortunately, because that would put this nightmare at an end for us. But no, nobody lost.
By the way, why do you say that? When the Gantz coalition had only 39 seats, why can't you say he lost?
Gantz has a much harder path to the prime minister's chair.
Wait a minute. Does he have any path?
He does.
What's his path?
Welcome to the chaos math of Israeli coalition politics. Let's say that because Netanyahu has the same numbers he had in April, even a tiny bit less, assuming the vote bears out, let's say that Netanyahu fails, as he did in April and as he did in September, to form a coalition after being given the first chance by the president. Let's say that Gantz then gets the second bid to become prime minister, as he did in September. We're talking about things that have already happened in this election cycle, extended election cycle. Then Gantz begins to reach his deadline, 28 days, the president extended 14 more. He begins to reach his deadline for the coalition, after which we're almost certainly going to a 4th election. And as he reaches that precipice, you suddenly have a lot of parties start to calculate their chances in a 4th election. Shas just went up to 10 seats. Does it really want an election where it dropped back down to 7? Israel Beitel was blamed for the April election, for the defeat in September, held that its own, did not agree to join Netanyahu in September, and now will again maybe be punished by voters if it's seen as a cause of yet another election. Labor Gesher Mered is a coalition that has shrunk with every election. Does it really want a 4th? You start to find across the aisle a lot of people right at that edge of right before the 4th election, down to this chance to be prime minister, desperate not to go there. And then Gantz doesn't need them to join his coalition. He can have a minority government whose actual members are fewer than 61, but he has 61 votes with outside parties that just don't want 4th election and agree to make him prime minister and then continue the negotiating process over the next year or month, and then Gantz becomes prime minister.
Okay.
There's a moment for the 4th election.
I want to see the numbers up. I want to see the numbers up on the screen one more time, and I want to go through this with.
Incidentally,
Haviv. Just a minute. We have 32 blue and white. Add 7 is 39. If you add Shas, it's 49.
Yes.
United Torah, 49 and 7 is 56. Would
Yes.
Yamina go with blue and white?
Yamina would have an easier time with blue and white than Shas and UTJ probably.
Okay, but
Yamina
the
and
only
Labor
way
have sat in coalition together.
blue and white gets to 61 is if Shas and United Torah go with it.
Yes, or Shas and Lieberman.
Shas and who?
And Yisrael Beitenu.
Shas and Yisrael Beitenu, that's 17. But you just said it would be hard for Shas to go with blue and white.
Yes. No, not with blue and white. It would be hard for Shas to go with Lieberman.
And Lieberman has said he's not going to go with the Orthodox.
Lieberman has said two things. He said yesterday, and he promised, he said, these are my promises to my voters. This is what my voters expect from me. There will not be a fourth election, and I will not sit with the ultra-Orthodox.
Okay.
Now, those are contradictions, right? Those are two opposite things. And he does the math as well as we do the math. And that suggests that there are even stranger options that Lieberman and several other political figures might actually be hoping for. For example, here's an option in which Lieberman wins the election. Lieberman with 7 seats. It goes something like this. Netanyahu does not pass the 59-seat barrier that he now has, 59-seat line. He goes to Lieberman and he says to Lieberman, you won't sit in my coalition, you swore not to. But will you vote for it just to establish a minority government? Lieberman says, of course. I believe in right-wing ideas. I'm your buddy from 25 years ago. Of course, let's establish a Netanyahu-led right-wing ultra-Orthodox coalition with 59 seats. As soon as you need to pass a budget, and in Israeli law, if a government doesn't pass a budget, the government falls and we go to election. So you need to pass that budget. As soon as you need to pass that budget, you come to Lieberman and you say, hey, you're not in the coalition. You're not a defense minister. You don't have chairmanships of parliamentary committees. You're just 4, 5, 6, 7 seats that without your vote, I don't have a budget. So whatever you want in the budget, you can have. Lieberman will have a veto on every no confidence vote, every budget vote. He will have a veto on the other 59 people in that government. He will not sit in that government, and he'll be able to tell his voters, for whom religion and state issues are very, very important, and some other issues, that he held the line on every issue that matters to them. He completely neutralized the ultra-Orthodox. He was tremendously influential, key voice on the state budget, all while sitting as a junior member of the opposition outside the government. It is a scenario that Lieberman. So it gets complicated.
It certainly is. By the way, what you just described, is that theoretically possible? Or Haviv, do you think that it may not be the most probable, but it is absolutely a real possibility?
I can tell you that just like you've been doing the math for Benny Gantz has been doing that math as well. And Benny Gantz has known for a year that he does not have a majority coalition. He has a unity government with Likud option, and he has a minority government in which various factions that are not part of his coalition join him for no confidence votes and for budget votes, and he essentially has to buy them for that. He has to give them their priorities in the budget, etc. And Benjamin Netanyahu said during the election, Benny Gantz will be dependent on the Arab party. It's not true that he'll be dependent on the Arab parties alone. Instead of the Arab parties, be dependent on the ultra-Orthodox parties. But he will eventually have to be dependent with that minority government on people outside the government. So that's Gantz's only victory strategy. And I don't think it's at all unreasonable to believe, especially since Lieberman explained to us that every other vision of this, every other solution he refuses to do. He refuses to sit in a Netanyahu-Haredi coalition. He refuses to have fourth election. And there is no majority with Gantz. Therefore, I think that sitting outside a Netanyahu coalition, supporting from outside and getting bought constantly and constantly managing to extort, I mean that in a good way, we elect parties in order to pressure governments to pull policies and funding in their direction. That's how our system works. So extort in the good sense of the term. That's I think, his strategy. And Netanyahu's strategy is to do anything he can to get past 61 so he is free.
Of course.
Not be constantly dependent on all these forces.
By the way, Haviv, that was a very intricate, complicated analysis you just gave us. Do you think most Israelis on the street understand the possibilities as you describe them? In other words, one of the things that I said in the open is I would love to understand what the Israeli mentality is now in the aftermath of the elections. I wonder if they are sitting in their homes wondering about these various permutations and understanding that they are possible and yet complicated. Or is this something because you're the political analyst of the Times of Israel, this is your job. You spend days, and for all I know, you spend nights as well, trying to figure all this out and analyzing it as best you can. Is this something you understand and most Israelis don't? Or if I talk to Israelis, would they all tell me these possibilities are on the table?
Good question. I'd like to think I'm very clever. I think that everything I have presented so far, most Israelis are aware of a great deal of it. And the reason I say that, for one thing, Likud has argued it as a central pillar of its campaign. One of its campaign slogans was Bibi or TB. Benjamin Netanyahu, or you'll end up having a Gantz government that is dependent on Ahmed Tibi of the Arab Joint List, and therefore somehow, I don't know what, won't be Zionist or is a danger to the country. Likud never clarified why Ahmed Tibi is so terrible. In Ahmed Tibi's long legislative career, he has passed many pieces of legislation and been very respected by a great number of Likud lawmakers. But he is turned into this bogeyman of the election campaign. And so Likud explicitly discussed with the Israeli voter as its campaign slogan this question of being a minority government dependent on other parties. That Lieberman aims that high, we know. Lieberman is a very ambitious man. I don't think anything I said will surprise Israeli voters. I can tell you that this entire conversation to Israelis would sound very, very frustrating. We have some really fascinating early numbers on not just on where people voted, but on which ballot stations moved from one party to another. In other words, how people switched. And we're finding really surprising things. Likud's success in this round appears to be not so much love of Netanyahu as a kind of desperation to end the election cycle. Yeah. So we saw, for example, a movement from Labor and from Blue and White, not large, maybe half a seat each, to Likud. And these are people who want it to end. These are not people who love Netanyahu. They just think that Netanyahu is a faster way out of the deadlock. And we saw quite a few, probably 2 or 3 seats, of people who had not voted last election now voting Likud. So the Likud vote appears to be an end the election vote. And this whole discussion, Israelis are very keenly aware that Netanyahu is at 59 and not the 61 we need to get out of this cycle.
Mm-hmm. Haviv, was the key issue in this election Bibi Netanyahu? And was it really a referendum on him personally? Or were there other issues that determined the vote?
I think it's the first. I think that's exactly right. The people who lead Blue and White, Benny Gantz was the chief of staff appointed by Netanyahu, long praised by Netanyahu. Netanyahu extended his term as chief of staff in 2015. Moshe Ya'alon, the number 3 in Blue and White, was Netanyahu's, not only his defense minister, but his very close ally in building Israel's Iran policy. When it comes to the economy, Blue and White and Likud have identical policies. There isn't really a culture war on any actual substantive policy differences. Like in America, you have a divide over abortion, a divide over healthcare, things like that. So you will struggle to find meaningful policy differences between Blue and White and Likud. And that reflects the Israeli electorate. There's a consensus on a great many issues, from Palestinians to Iran to economics, in terms of ideology. There really is a consensus. But Netanyahu has been in power for 10 years. And while a lot of Israelis feel he's done a very good job, there are a lot of Israelis, as you should have, it's only healthy in a society, in a democratic society, for a leader who's been in power for 10 years, who feel he's actually missed a great many things that matter. Our education system is desperately lagging in terms of funding and in terms of infrastructure, in terms of all kinds of issues. We are underperforming our education system, which for a country like us that's so dependent on human capital because we have very little other resources, that's a strategic threat in the long term. We are one of the most centralized and monopoly-driven economies in the developed world. There are 69 recognized monopolistic companies recognized as monopolies by the Israeli government, and therefore regulated as such, which is the highest of any developed country. So there are all sorts of issues. We have transportation. We have way too few kilometers of road per kilometers driven, which is to say our roads are much, much more jammed up in traffic than most developed nations. So there are a lot of things that people say, once you've been prime minister for 10 years, and these are structural problems that we're still experiencing in our daily lives, it's time to have someone else. That was the debate. That was the debate in the election. Netanyahu gave us a very close relationship with the Americans, a very important policy in Iran that today most Israelis see as having been right policy over the last 10 years. The economy has grown and developed in good ways, about average for the OECD developed countries. But for a country that came way behind the developed world, that's not bad for the last 10 years. So Netanyahu has successes and people who love him, and he also has a lot of people who are sick of him and want to see him go.
Yes.
And that's been what this election.
By the way, I wanted to ask you how the Israeli left feels today. So many on the left feel about Netanyahu as many American Jews feel on the left feel about Donald Trump. Many people just hate him, and I've spoken to many Israelis here in America on the left who say it's time for him to leave, and that basically there has been under his time of leadership a deterioration of Israeli morale and civility. And again, much of what we hear about Donald Trump in America, you hear about Netanyahu. So how do you think today the left feels when they see that it's not likely that Benny Gantz is going to be able to form a coalition government, and there's a good chance they're going to end up once again with Benjamin Netanyahu? How do they feel?
There are two different definitions of left in the Israeli political psyche. There's an ideological left that clings to the ideas of the 1990s, the Oslo peace agreements. It's a very progressive left. And we saw what it did in this election. It gave us about 7 seats. It doesn't like Netanyahu. It sees him as an ideological foe, but it's too small to feel like it lost the election, in the sense that it wasn't on track to win anything meaningful in this election. So if you define the left as that classic, where the Labor Party is today in Israel, it used to be 44 seats. In this election, I think there'll be 3 members of the Labor Party in the Knesset, which is astonishing. This is a party that once founded the state of Israel 72 years ago. So if that's the left, then it has very little to complain about Netanyahu. It failed too spectacularly for Netanyahu to be the problem. But if you think of Benny Gantz as representing a kind of centrist left, the left of the 1980s, the old Israeli left, the left that fought wars, the left that actually won the 67th war and could expand the borders of Israel, a left that was a lot more hawkish and a lot more also pragmatic, and Benny Gantz tried to represent that left, then I think there's a very strong sense of bitterness over how hard it has turned out to be to come out from under Netanyahu's shadow. It's important to say something here that President Rivlin said this week, yesterday, about being ashamed. Likud just ran, and maybe there's a parallel here to Trump. I don't follow American politics minute to minute, so I don't want to hazard a comparison that might not be a good one. Likud just ran the most despicable, the dirtiest, the most dishonest campaign easily in the history of Israel. I mean, senior people in Likud, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu himself, have been throwing around in this campaign as part of the campaign strategy allegations that there are sex videos of Benny Gantz that were hacked from his phone and are now in the hands of Iranian intelligence, and therefore he can be extorted if he becomes prime minister. This is something that the Likud campaign has openly and publicly and explicitly, including Netanyahu personally, advanced as a theory. Likud and Netanyahu himself personally have said on television or suggested on television, without ever saying it as a fact, but suggesting it might be something we should be thinking about as Israelis, that Benny Gantz has dementia and has various kinds of mental illness. This isn't an accidental thing. It isn't just that they're being coarse and vulgar. There is strategy here. Marketing degrees 25 years ago were about how to create creative messaging. Marketing degrees today are about science and what we know from social psychology, what we know from neuroscience, and we are learning slowly how to hack the human brainstem. And the people most fascinated by this, other than the marketing department of Coca-Cola, which wants to convince us all to drink something unhealthy, but the people most fascinated by this new science are political campaigns. And there's things that these political campaigns are starting to learn, and that Likud is way ahead of the curve in adopting in Israel, and there are things that should worry us. Can I give you an example?
Yes, but only but 1 minute left.
You cannot, if I tell you don't think of a pink rhinoceros, you cannot not think of a pink rhinoceros.
Right.
For a simple neuroscience reason, your brain creates an image of the thing that it then compares your other thoughts to make sure you're not thinking it. But by definition, you're holding that image to compare to, right? So you can't not think of a pink rhinoceros. If I were to tell you that a friend of mine named Bob, a completely fictional person, raped a young woman. Now, Bob is fictional, and I am lying to you. I am telling you I'm lying to you. If Bob was not fictional and you then met him, and I told you I was lying to you before and after telling you about this non-existing rape, you would still associate that association of rape with Bob. You can't not. That's hacking the human brainstem. And you can hack the human brainstem by just talking to it. And that's the Likud strategy in the last month of the campaign, to talk about Gantz as, and when one reporter challenged Netanyahu and said, you said Benny Gantz had terrible things, but you know those are lies. Netanyahu said, let them deny it. Let them deny it. And a Likud lawmaker named Miki Zohar said, in response to reporters asking the same question, politics is a big boy game. And if you can't handle it, you shouldn't be in it. Now, maybe that's it. Maybe I'll grow up and be allowed to talk about each other having fake sex scandals to try and undermine support and hack the human brainstem in that way. Maybe we should have these campaigns of utter filth and dirt and manipulation. Or maybe being an adult is not doing that. That's a moral question Israel is now grappling with. That's what this campaign looks like. So when people talk about there's a visceralness to the of the manipulation, the way the man has led. Now, all of his successes are successes. They're real successes. But there's a sense that he's losing something of the fundamental sort of way we do things in Israeli politics that has existed until today.
Okay. Unfortunately, what you have described, you want to believe that in Israel this doesn't happen, and you'd like to believe that in America it doesn't happen. And we know that sadly it happens here. Both parties engage in what you've just described, and it's disappointing to hear. It's very troubling to hear that either party, in this case you're saying that Likud did this, and you're giving us evidence, and we've seen stories about this as well. So it is disappointing, and if we had more time, I'd want to develop this idea further with you. So the next time we speak, I may want you to talk about this more, because the question is, again, I asked you, how are the Israeli people reacting in the aftermath of this election? What are they experiencing, and how are they processing it? What you just described is really terrible, and I'd like to know in a subsequent conversation how that is being processed and what are the consequences of this? But right now I have to say we're simply out of time. It is wonderful to talk to you. You give me wonderful insight so that I can share you with our JBS audience. I say it every time I speak to you. I adore you, and we will chase you, and you'll be on time and time again. And thank you as always for giving so much of yourself late at night in Israel to JBS. Thank you, Haviv.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Haviv Rettig Gur, political analyst for the Times of Israel. The political story in Israel continues to unfold. Will Benjamin Netanyahu be able to persuade at least 2 other Knesset members to join his coalition, or will we wind up with some of the other scenarios that you heard described by Haviv? We'll stay on the story, so please stay with us on JBS. My thanks as always to our director, Sloan Copeland, JBS Managing Director, Dara Golub, Technical Manager, Michael Paley, Transmission Manager, John McDevitt, and to the producer of tonight's In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.